I didn't say this at 9:39, but really quickly I want to say that there's an interesting thing about the Hebrew Scriptures out of which our text came today, and that is that they leave a place for lament, a place for questioning, a place for railing. And if I were going to preach on that, I would say more, but for now I'll say that we don't always have to rush past lament, as many of the Psalms do. They run quickly, it seems, to praise. Well, that's because it's a psalm. They're writing about everything, but we don't know how much time passes between the lament and the journey that gets us back to praise. The problem is sometimes we want to rush through it, and we miss some energy that is born of lament and mourning, energy that might propel us into something else. Okay, well, what I think I'm doing today, what I am thinking I'm doing today, is telling stories about my life and also weaving in some other stories to talk about a crisis of faith. As Tom told you, the W today is when things fall apart and the center cannot hold. Part of that poem is on the back of your program if you want to look at it later. I'm co-opting the poet's language to use center to mean faith, but I'm not talking about just faith in general. Is that something I'm doing? Making that noise? Okay. I'm not talking about just faith in general, because faith is always particular. It's mine, or it's yours, or it's someone else's. I'm talking about when the faith that we have had begins to change, it begins to waver, perhaps it disappears. And thank you, Austin gave me a thing on that. Okay, I don't want you to miss this. Faith, sometimes our faith begins to waver. It changes. It feels like it's disappearing. And so I want to talk about that today. And it may well be that the way I talk about it doesn't resonate particularly with you, but I feel sure that you know somebody who stood on the banks of a faith crisis. For many people in life, the path actually does take us to the cold waters of crisis. And that crisis can take all kinds of shapes. It can begin against the backdrop of strong faith, of weak faith, of no faith. I don't think that's me. I don't want y'all to miss this. This is such a great sermon. Just kidding. Okay, no, it is a serious subject. Faith crisis. Sometimes it happens because of tragedy, right? But sometimes it actually happens because faith and reason collide. For some, the crisis might seem like a defiant shaking your fist at the universe. But maybe it feels for others like a sullen sulking into the hinterlands of the psyche. Still, for others, it's like an existential loneliness, where you're moving through life looking for meaning, and the words of God, the words about God, the will of God are in the airwaves all around you, and you find those words in the mouths of people you love, and you recognize the words, but they don't mean anything to you anymore. And so sometimes it's like that. Now, some people go ahead and find a way out of the crisis, and they return to the sweet certainty that they've always known, while others find another path, a path marked with different symbols and different language, like visiting a new country where the street signs are different. But somehow, the ground holds you up again, only this time it is uncertainty, not certainty. That is your sacrament. It is your holy gift that you offer. I grew up in a small town in North Georgia in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I was always happier outside than inside, playing outside with my brother, riding bikes, playing baseball with my brother and my cousins. In our family, if there was no chance of lightning, we could play out in the rain all we wanted to. So I remember one day playing baseball for so long that we knocked the cover off of our one wet and soggy baseball. Now, I saw that baseball coming to me, and I noticed that it was hampered a little by the hanging leather and by the threads that were frayed, and it sort of wobbled as it came near my glove. Well, what I didn't know was that the sun and the moon and the stars all wobble, And that one day, scientists would start thinking about that stuff to talk about the existence of God. I never heard a thing about that. But I did catch that baseball, much to the disappointment of my cousin Mac, who was 12 years old. My cousins didn't go to church very much, but they still knew about heaven and hell. And how I know that is one day we were burying a turtle that had passed from this life, and my cousin Max said, "That turtle's going to heaven." Now, I had my doubts about this because at my church, we never talk about animals having souls, and I felt really sure that heaven is a place for souls. I did, however, wonder and worry about my cousins and what would happen to them after death because they didn't go to church. And Uncle Luther was, as we said, bad to drink. For me, church was you go to wine and wishful thinking with me, don't you? For me, church was the center of my life from my birth and really, obviously, till now, here I am. My family went to church 3 times a week, and they were very intense. Our whole church was very intense about church attendance. In fact, when I was 16 years old, one of the boys in my youth group drowned. He was on a little trip with his father, who was not a churchgoer. Donald drowned on a Sunday. He wasn't at church. He was at the lake. His mother tearfully told my mother the plan was to have an early morning swim and then get back to church on time. He would have been there, she said. Now, I thought, well, surely God understands that. That's how I reasoned it. And I thought that my mother felt the same way, but we were both very aware of the intense fear that surrounded not going to church, putting fun before God, sinning purposefully and willfully. My mother and I didn't speak to that doubt to each other. I guess we just hoped in it for a while. We didn't talk about the doubt we had in our church's belief. We tried carefully to order our lives in the way that would please God, trying to obey God in everything, because though God loved us, he was particular and strict, and we ourselves were easily prone to sin. Now, of course, God had saved us from all that bad, but that salvation could be easily lost, especially if you did not repent immediately. Surely Donald had repented, I reasoned. Now, all that sounds like the stuff of bitter memories, and it may sound to you like that I'm making fun or railing against old beliefs. But really, of course, that view of God is tragic and unfortunate and probably is still around somewhere. But what it also is the understanding of childhood and the idea that maybe we all have or had that we alone are questioning orthodoxy, and that simply isn't true. But really, what those memories are for me are strands of thought in the tapestry of my life as I tried to figure out God and faith in my own particular religious context and in my world of the time. Every person, I think, is weaving a tapestry of understanding that, like the song says, it's a tapestry to feel and see, but it's impossible to hold because things are always changing. Our perspective is always changing, even our perspective on the past. We wake up altered every day. And in truth, for me, all of the hard places of my childhood were sustained by that God I knew, with all of his strictness and strangeness and hisness. Of this I was sure. I was somehow always able to come back to happiness, even when the world fell apart. I was one of those little girls who did not escape childhood unharmed. There was the babysitter's husband and his teenage son. And they threatened me with worse things if I told. For a whole year, when I was 5 years old, these things happened to me. But finally, I started to school. There was no more need for the babysitter, and it was all over. But I would find out years later that this same trespass of the soul happened to my little brother. If I'd known it, I would have saved him. My little 5-year-old self would have saved him. But it didn't occur to me to ask why God didn't. I remember how the wind blew off of those North Georgia mountains with its honeysuckle breath. And I told my little brother, that is the sweet breath of God blowing through our hair while we rode our bicycles. And without knowing it, I was learning that healing takes place in the most ordinary circumstances of love and time and beauty and fun. And without knowing it, without knowing how biology works to heal us, it was happening because my brother and I made a contest out of seeing who could sweat the most. And we ran and we rode our bikes and we climbed trees and we would compare our sweat rings, our necklaces, as Mother used to call them. It wasn't fair that he got to run around with his shirt off. No, you could always see how much he was sweating. Somehow things were eventually okay for the two of us, but not for our parents. Between the years of 8 and 9, I lived my life in that empty space between hope that it wasn't happening and certainty that it was. I heard their loud arguments in the night, and I often felt sick to my stomach, wrenched by the turmoil of love that was leaking out of our house. I hoped that their marriage wouldn't end, but it did. And my brothers and I were left with a mother who loved us, but whose anger and sadness sometimes overspilled the boundaries. Our church excommunicated my dad. Mom and brothers and I, we skipped church that Sunday that they said it out loud. Sinning willfully, I guess. Well, somewhere around the time when Dad was leaving home, packing up his stuff, Mom took us to a state park so we wouldn't have to be there when he left. And there was a shallow stream at the park, and there were rocks big enough for us to walk on. And I remember how cool the water felt on my feet. And I noticed the tree branches that stretched out and hung low, reaching out to hug us, I thought. The arms of God, while my brothers and I walked on water. But the church, for all of its strictness and all of its obedience to doctrine, the church was also strong arms of love for me and encouragement. I remember running around in the church parking lot after church chasing fireflies. Chasing boys, girls chasing boys, boys chasing girls. We were playing until our parents finally said we had to get in the car and go home. And I remember knowing that so many adults in that church loved me. And they encouraged me. And they made me feel like I was actually pretty special. Whenever I was accomplishing anything at church or at school, they were a part of that for me. And though maybe our church had not progressed enough at that point in time to know that it might have helped me to talk about that thing with my parents' divorce, still they nurtured me. And I took to it. It would be years before I knew how sorry my father was for the pain he had caused us. And it would be years before the miraculous stream of forgiveness and reconciliation would break open. But I was lucky. It did. It broke open. Now, Dad didn't come home, but my mom found her peace. And I, defying the religion I knew at the time, I forgave my dad, and I pronounced to everyone that God had forgiven my father. Now, for some people, that was hard to accept. They were slow to accept such a notion that my father could divorce and get married again and still be forgiven. Just kind of like the church has been slow to ordain women or slow to accept blacks among us, and now slow to embrace our gay and lesbian friends. But however fast or slow these things happen, it does seem like that the world is always somehow falling apart. But God and faith and religion are always somewhere in that widening gyre. Well, the Vietnam War came. It was just a couple of decades after many of our fathers had come back from Korea. And some of the boys just a couple of years older than me went, and of course some did not come home. In 1971, George Harrison's Bangladesh concert in the Madison Square Gardens awakened me to another reality that I had not considered, and that was genocide and starvation. And I began to think about these horrors and these tragedies. But another thing I noticed at that concert that I'd never known before, and that is that people who shared a whole different worldview from me, a whole different faith, cared about all of this stuff, and they were trying to do something. They were trying to say something, and they were doing it with weeping guitars. I didn't know that would help. It was a way to extend love, a way that I had never considered before as a part of the good news. Well, I went away to college, and I began to have a crisis with the Bible. Some American Christians were loudly protesting the teaching of evolution in the schools, saying that science was leading our children away from God. Well, thankfully, those armies of God did not stop the advance of science. But all of those things, all of these things that I've told you about my childhood, about my discovery of this thing and that thing, and about all that was going on in the world, caused for me sort of a collision of reason and faith. And they began to be steps that would lead me away from the faith I had known for so long and from the understanding of God that has sustained me. So anyway, I found myself on a new path, questioning my beliefs in God as the great fixer, my beliefs that God was always the great rewarder of the faithful and the punisher of the evil. And at first I felt guilt and fear, and for a while, loneliness. If God was not all I had thought, if the Bible was not everything I'd understood, the center was not holding for me. Things were falling apart. And all of this was and remains so complicated because there are people I love who aren't worried about the things I'm worried about. They're not troubled about these things. And further, they think that my questions actually have easy answers. It's all in the will of God. It's also hard because it's kind of easier to talk about what I don't believe than what I do. I mean, it's complicated, isn't it? How do you talk about something that is so many things at once, so great and so small, so certain in its uncertainty? So I know I have to stop somewhere with this meandering, and so I'm going to pause at this way station. And I've talked about some things from my little life and some things in the larger world, and you have your stories too. And surely the world has unfolded now for all of us in many ways since those days so long ago. And I don't think of myself as drawing any conclusions exactly, but I'm just making some observations that seem to me to have universal notes. God and religion and faith have been called the opiate of the masses. But haven't those same things also been the stimulant? Yes, I know. Sometimes a stimulus for evil, but not just an opiate. In every terror and in every tragedy, there has been overwhelming goodness. I know things are passing through your mind right now of things that we have all seen that remind us there is something greater than just me. There's something so amazing that it moves us, even in tragedy, not to give up. And also, every culture, every religion has stories about heroes and demons, stories about death and resurrection, about virtue and vice, about something like consequences and karma. Everyone looks for words to describe something that's hard to know and hard to pin down. And we look for words to talk about the symbiosis of misery and love, of joy and sorrow, of good and evil, and of the grim reality that what is good for one of us is sometimes devastating for another. We all try to put words to this. And that's true for every religion and every faith. And it seems to me that everyone also has some sense of the feeling that Mike read for us from Ecclesiastes, and that is that things just go on and on and on in a continual cycle of birth and death. So, though we all experience times when things fall apart, both personally and communally, I take heart knowing that while things are falling apart, things are always coming back together too. And disparate parts sometimes find a way to fit together when they had never before. So I keep hope. And the stories from my early life, as well as the things I learned in seminary and the things I learn every day, resonate with me. Those stories may be filtered in some different ways, interpreted in some other ways. But what really, really matters is that I believe love wins. And so I hope for you that you can keep that faith too when everything's falling apart. Peace.